Welcome to today's video on thematic analysis. In this video I'll be giving you a broad introduction to thematic analysis. So I'm going to start by defining what I mean by thematic analysis. So thematic analysis is a systematic research method that focuses on identifying patterns of meaning in qualitative data. It's an iterative process of moving from data to codes to themes. And that builds an ever-evolving picture of the meaning in your data, which you'll have gathered from multiple sources or multiple participants. And there's lots of different flavours of this thematic analysis. So this video introduces one way of doing it that has some flexibility in its implementation. So there's two main things that you're going to hear about when we discuss thematic analysis, and that's codes and themes. So a code is a label that's used to describe the meaning of an excerpt of data. Think of that like tagging. So you might have a hashtag on a tweet, for example. That's a code. You've got one small piece of data and you're tagging it with some semantic to give it meaning. Typically, when we get to the end of our process, we'll have both a label and a description for each of those tags. A theme is a feature from the data that emerges when related findings appear across multiple participants or data sources. So that's usually a combination of codes coming together, and usually, again, there's a label and a description for that as well. So Brown and Clark have a 2006 paper which is viewed as really being the paper for thematic analysis. And what you often find is that there are 6 steps and they're often viewed as a linear process, although they do make it clear within the paper that it's an iterative process. Now, what I think it should be represented like is something like this. So I think we want to represent familiarisation with data, so we need to be aware of what the data is that we're working with, and that familiarisation with the data encompasses the next steps, which are generating the initial codes, generating the initial themes, reviewing those themes, and then naming and defining them before moving towards producing the report. Of course, we can iterate over the codes and themes multiple times if we so wish, if we need to. And the one thing I just want to point out here is that if you look at number 3 there, it's generating themes. In the original paper that said searching for themes, but they've since kind of updated their thinking around that with the idea that actually generating themes is a much more active process. So let's go through each stage section by section, and the first of those is familiarisation with the data. So you, as the researcher doing the analysis, needs to be familiar with the participant and the data that's generated from that transcription as part of the process of familiarisation. Now, I prefer to transcribe my own data for this reason, but I don't always have time to do that. So if I don't have time to transcribe my own data, I would have someone else do it, obviously, but then I would read that transcript, wait a day, and then read it again. So I'm letting that content just solidify within my own thinking. And if I have time, which I always try and do because it's a good investment of time at this stage, is I'll re-listen to that interview or I'll re-watch the videos or whatever is being transcribed, just so that I can connect again in my head the written content with what was actually said. The next stage, stage 2, is about generating those initial codes. So a code itself is a description. It's not necessarily an interpretation of what that data means at this stage. You're just describing what it says. Now you want to think about your research question when you do this, and that's the way that you identify relevant content within the transcript as opposed to coding everything, which will get out of hand very quickly. So we're avoiding jumping to a reasoning too quickly. So the first action is to highlight and note a code. Try and capture what's interesting about that particular excerpt of data. And then what you probably want to do is review those codes to make sure that they make sense, that they're descriptive, etc. So this might be a few passes throughout the transcript to gather all of this code level data. What I think you should do is avoid one word code names. So one word is like unlikely to be like sufficiently descriptive. So try and use a few words to describe what it is you're trying to capture. And you want to end with this stage with a list of codes and all of the data attached to them. So it's really important that you're able to track the data right through that process, because when we get to the very end, you're going to use the data to illustrate and back up, the analysis that you've created. So if you do it on paper, it might look something like this, where you've just got a printed transcript and you start with making notes. If my analysis resource isn't too big, or I'm not collaborating remotely, that collaboration adds a dimension, then I like to do it on paper because I just think more clearly with tangible things in front of me and I'm more focused. That's a personal preference. Eventually you might get to the stage where you can cut out sections of your transcript and use these as tangible entities, as base code data. And some people prefer to use a software package. So there's a software package called NVivo, which is the most popular one. And that's a specific software package that supports qualitative analysis. So you highlight a section and you give it a label, you tag it with that label, and they're displayed in that linear format on the right hand side to give you some link between the code and the data. So this is an example from a paper that you should have read already, and it's this kind of interview excerpt is from the supplementary material. So this is the paper, A Framework for Speech Reading Acquisition Tools, and Dr. Gorman's included in his published copy of the paper in the digital library a whole section on supplementary material which shows his process from his initial transcript, his initial codes, into his thematic maps and outcomes. So these snippets, in his case, have been coded using a piece of software. Each of those codes has a label and a description, and that's the code book. So you'll hear people talk about having a code book. That's essentially a dictionary of all of the codes and all of the descriptions that they have. So the format in which you do that is up to you. Some people prefer to use a spreadsheet, that's what Dr. Gorman has. Some people use a Word document, some people use post-its or index cards. But the check here is, if you take away the data, does the code book make sense? Does the code with just the name make sense? So if you strip it back without all of this description around it, do you understand what it's about as someone who is, familiar with the data and understands what it's trying to say, but also as someone who may not be, will other people make sense of that? So the third thing on the list is about generating themes. So remember that these were originally described as searching for themes, but that's been updated to represent the active process of creating those themes. So you have a set of codes or labels for the data. Now you need to link the codes together somehow. So each group of codes should represent a theme, and each theme needs to be distinctive and also part of a larger whole. So ways you might get to a theme is that you might cluster codes together because they share similarities. They may all be about speech reading classes, or all be about speech reading instructors, or all be about speech reading methods, for example. Or you might promote an important or a larger code to be a theme in itself and iterate over the data in that way. You might also have subthemes, and that will emerge over time because if you have similarities in themes, you might create an overarching meaning as a theme and create those as subthemes. So things to look out for. Don't categorize codes. That's what's called creating bucket themes. So don't categorize things as, positive things, negative things, happy emotion, sad emotion. That doesn't really give you the why out of the data. Keep the research question in mind, but don't use it to create the themes themselves. It's easy to categorise things based on a question. So if you take the question, how do older adults use and experience emoji? We might end up saying, well, this is about experiencing and this is about sending an emoji. That's categorising. We want to know why they do those things, right? Focus on the data itself to create your codes and your themes. So make sure there's some meaning behind the theme, and this is the idea that there's a central organising concept that binds all of those themes together. So you can ask that question as you go through. Are these themes related? Is there a big picture that I'm generating here? So this gives you an idea, this is the same picture as before, of what it might look like when it's done by hand. So each small bit of paper is a data excerpt that is a code, and I've linked those together and labelled them using post-it notes, and then separately I have a document that I was using to keep track of the descriptions for each code and the themes, so I can use that to review my ideas. And I did this analysis over several days, so it was super useful for me to keep that sort of journal of what I was thinking as I went through the process. Stage 4 then is reviewing those themes. So it's really important to iterate over the themes, and you might want to go back to either the data itself or to the initial codes to help you do that. And some of the things that you want to be thinking about when you're doing that review, because it needs to be an active review. You're not just reading over your work, you're reflecting on the work that you've done before. So is it a theme? It's not a categorization. Is it descriptive? What's the quality of that theme? Are you confident that that's a good name and a good description? Is there enough data to support the theme? If not, could it actually be a code in itself? Or do you need to consider that the codes that are part of that theme, could you actually break it up into sub-themes or different themes? And finally, you need to be prepared to let things go. Remove themes that don't make sense, because your thinking will change, your thinking will evolve based on more and more understanding of that data. So the more understanding you generate for yourself, the more you'll want to make adjustments. If it's the first idea that you end up with, then you probably didn't do it right. You have to really understand it at a deeper level, so those new ideas will emerge when you iterate over the content. So let's go back to Dr. Gorman's paper. This is his initial thematic map from the supplementary materials. So we can see that he has his central concept there is speech reading classes. And he has different themes and sub-themes that are related and connected to one another. So as a reminder, he had 7 interviews that he worked through to create this map. Now this is his final map. So you can see the amount of iteration that's happened here over time, and that might not have been linear, there might have been something else in the middle, but there are themes that have been deleted and there are sub-themes that have been deleted. You might also decide that you need to generate new ones depending on how much data you have to support those. You might, for example, promote a sub-theme to a theme or a code to a sub-theme. Then once we have that map, we need to define and name those themes. So each theme or sub-theme should have a name or a label and a definition or a description. That's the same as you've generated for the codes, so that all together this should form a complete story. So once you're happy with your thematic mapping, you can then update your codebook to include these. Now remember that I said I did keep a copy of my kind of working definition of these themes as I went through. So if you do that, this process becomes simpler because you have some kind of content to work and evolve from. And then the final stage is producing the report. So typically when we talk about producing a report, we're talking about the results and discussion of those results within a scientific paper. So how you present your results is key, because what you need to be able to do is present the data and your assertions from it in a structured way. It may not seem like it's very structured the first time you read a qualitative paper, but there's typically some norms that you can follow. So the results section, that consists of an analytic commentary or a narrative, and that shows the themes, how they're related, and gives data, extracts, or quotes that provide evidence. So the first thing you want to do is figure out the story that you'll tell with your results, and to do that you need to kind of come up with an order in which to represent your themes. That may not be kind of start at 12 o'clock and work round clockwise on your thematic map. You may decide that a reader might need to know about this one theme before the others will really make complete sense. Then you need to select sample data for each theme. So for each theme you provide some quotes. Try and quote across participants and sources to show the depth of your data. If you have, like 7 participants and you only quote from 2 of them, then the reader's left wondering what happened to the other 5 interviews and how representative your analysis really is if it doesn't include those other 5 participants. So once you have that presentation of your results, you then lead into a discussion session, and that's about relating your analysis to the research question, to the literature, and to the wider context that the work has taken place. That's the same principle of discussion in a quantitative paper as a qualitative paper. It's all about putting the results into a position within the literature and a context around them. But remember the need to let things go. You're not going to be able to show every bit of data or even include a narrative for every single code or idea that you have, so you're probably going to have to cut it down even more than you think. Typically that's due to page limits for publications and so on. So there's a balance to be struck between providing enough results to give your discussion some context and not providing enough results to really answer your question, your research question. So, think about that balance. Have you provided enough? But enough usually does not mean all. So prioritise the main themes as places to present the data in your report and then go from there. And as always, you'll just need to iterate over that until you get it to a point that you're happy with. A few drafts later, you start to see the story really settling and emerging. So key things about the process. The process is really important because it's the process of thematic analysis that drives the outcome. How you process and interact with the data is what is going to give you your results at the end of the day. The data itself is the vehicle to get you there. So following the systematic process, that's what gives thematic analysis the rigour that we need. So that process is where you can start to say, well, people are behaving in a consistent way, and so results can start to be compared on some level. So more places where we see kind of added rigour in this process is in the validation of the codes that you produce or the themes that you produce by either collaborators or external people to the project. So one way you might do this, you might use inter-rater reliability. That's where you give someone a section of the transcripts and you ask them to code them, and then you can get like a percentage agreement value. This isn't useful though if you don't use exclusive coding. So what you're likely to have is that one piece of information, it's possible to code that in more than one code. And when you can do that, then inter-rater reliability isn't useful because the calculations assume one piece of data is 0 or 1 codes. A more common way to do this, certainly in the type of work that I would do, is to code collaboratively or to build in review points through the process. So You might generate initial codes and then have someone review the transcript to see if it makes sense. And you could repeat that with themes and then continue until you have your final map. For me, if I'm doing an analysis on my own, I might present that analysis at research team meetings and have that sanity check from a group of people that the analysis is on track and making sense. Of course, I can't expect them to be as familiar with the data as I am, but they can review code names as being appropriate and that sort of thing. If I'm working in a team for a project, what we might do is have one person doing the bulk of the analysis and a second person doing something a bit like a coding retrospective. So at key points in the process, perhaps after iterations or as new themes emerge, there'll be that retrospective to have a validation that things are making sense at that point. Both people in that process are probably reasonably familiar with the data. They both might have been involved in gathering or transcribing it as a way to becoming familiar with it. But where do you end the process? How do we come out of that loop and move towards part 6, producing the report? So really simply, you end when you're iterating over the data and you're not making changes, or you're making only very small presentation type changes. So once the themes are in place and those themes are becoming consistent between iterations, then you're done. And then the real fun starts when you start iterating again over those results, but the presentation of them in that written form. So this has been an introductory summary of thematic analysis. As a method, it's got a lot of flexibility. This has been my preferred method and structure for doing things, but if you read more widely, you'll find many different variations of that. And the nuances of the implementation vary greatly depending on the design of your study. So this is one way of doing it, and I hope you found it useful.